They are called the laws of war, a code built over centuries, written in treaties like Geneva, meant to govern the worst of human conflict. A simple promise that even when fighting for life, honor would be maintained. But history shows that when the lines of battle blur, when hate is the driving force, honor often dies first. And no chapter reveals this dark truth better than the brutal, relentless interrogation of American POWs during the Vietnam War. In the popular imagination, the Vietnam War is fought in jungles and rice paddies. But for hundreds of American servicemen, pilots, navigators, and aircrew, the true war began the moment their parachutes hit the ground, or their planes were shot from the sky. They were instantly stripped of their status as soldiers and subjected to an institutionalized campaign of psychological and physical torture. Their journey led to a place whose name is synonymous with cruelty, the Hanoi Hilton. This is our thesis. The North Vietnamese interrogation system was designed not merely to extract information, but to shatter the moral and psychological foundation of the American fighting man. It was a war crime executed on an industrial scale, and the survival of these men became an incredible story of defiance, the will to resist against a system designed for total surrender. A man like Navy Lieutenant Commander Jeremiah Denton, shot down in 1965, the moment of capture was disorienting, from the cockpit of a multi-million-dollar jet to the hands of an angry mob. But the mob was just the prelude. The true enemy wore a uniform and carried a clipboard. Upon arrival, the system was simple: isolation and degradation. Stripped of identity, often given a number, crammed into tiny cells, the cubicles. The goal was to remove all familiar external supports, the rank, the uniform, the sense of self. It was a calculated clinical approach to breaking a man's spirit before breaking his body. But a few saw the long game. One figure, perhaps more prophetic than any, was Vice Admiral James Stockdale. Shot down later in 1965, he was immediately an influential figure. Stockdale understood that the Vietnamese were playing a psychological war, seeking propaganda victories, forced confessions, anti-war statements, and false moral condemnation of the American war effort. Stockdale foresaw the moral collapse that could happen if men were left to their own devices. His thesis became the antithesis to the North Vietnamese system. The code. He helped establish a secret system of tapping and hand signals. The tap code, a lifeline of communication, and leadership that ran like a hidden current beneath the prison floors. The interrogations were not slick, modern affairs. They were blunt instruments, rope bindings, leg irons, long periods of standing, starvation, and the infamous straps, torture where a man was bound and twisted into agonizing positions. The objective was the statement, a signature on a piece of paper, a public recording denouncing America. This is where the resilience ignited. When Commander Denton was paraded on camera, his jailers expected a broken, pliable man. Instead, he delivered a silent, defiant message. While appearing to cooperate, he blinked his eyes in Morse code, spelling out the word torture. It was a small, silent act, a flicker of light in absolute darkness. It told the world the truth, but it came at a monumental cost to Denton himself. For the North Vietnamese, this defiance was an affront. The screw was about to turn tighter. The prisoners, led by men like Stockdale, had chosen their line. No signature, no surrender. But how do you hold that line when every minute is a slow, agonizing death? The enemy had been outmaneuvered. Jeremiah Denton's blinking message had broadcast the ugly truth about their humane treatment. For the North Vietnamese guards, or the Kim Sat, it was a deep loss of face. The immediate response? A terrifying escalation. The prisoners, or uncooperative elements, were moved to the Heartbreak Hotel and other specialized camps designed for maximum isolation and pain. The goal shifted from simple intelligence gathering to systematic moral extermination. The interrogators now hunted for the secret leadership structure they knew existed. This new phase of torture wasn't just physical. It was psychological warfare. Men were held in pitch-black solitary confinement for months, sometimes years, with barely enough water and food to survive. The mind, starved of sensory input, becomes its own worst torturer, filling the silence with phantom noises and crushing despair. The central question of the prison became, how much pain is required for a lie? The interrogators wanted the statement, an admission of guilt, a denouncement of America. In 1967, one pivotal act would galvanize the entire POW community and create the legend of the resistance. The Vietnamese demanded that the senior ranking officer, James Stockdale, appear at a massive press conference to publicly condemn the U.S. bombing campaign. To the captors, this was the ultimate propaganda coup. To Stockdale, it was the final ethical battle. If he broke, the entire chain of command and morale would follow. Stockdale knew he could not allow a forced confession. His response was one of radical defiance. He smashed a stool over his own head, severely gashing his forehead, and then slit his wrists with a piece of broken glass. He was choosing catastrophe over collaboration. The Vietnamese were left with a bleeding, nearly unconscious man who was utterly unusable for propaganda. This moment was the catalytic event. It sent an unequivocal signal through the prison walls via the TAP code. The code of conduct holds. We fight back, even if it costs our lives. The TAP code, that simple 5x5 matrix, was the greatest counterweapon. It allowed information about torture methods, food distribution, new arrivals, and most crucially, leadership orders to flow. It was the antithesis of their isolation policy. Yet the code also brought internal disputes. What was the right line between resistance and survival? Some argued for giving minor information, a fake name, a past address, to avoid immediate death. Others, like Stockdale, enforced a strict no-cooperation policy. One common torture method used to break the code was to bring two friends together. Torture one and promise the other a break if he simply confessed his friend's minor TAP code infraction. This created a profound moral trap. Obedience to the enemy in order to save a friend. The battle was now not external, but internal. It was a war fought in the dark corners of the mind, where hours stretched into weeks and weeks into years. The resilience was cemented, but the human cost was staggering. We've seen the code. Now, we must look deeper at the men who broke, the men who held, and the psychological scars that defined the rest of their lives. For years, the war continued to rage, not just outside the walls, but within the minds of the men in the Hanoi Hilton. They had established their rules of defiance. Now they had to live them. The daily battle shifted from resisting one interrogation to surviving the next 1,000 days of isolation. The torture was never just about breaking bones. It was about erasing the future. The interrogators would whisper calculated psychological attacks. Your country has forgotten you. Your wife is with another man. The most insidious torture was the uncertainty. They had no idea if the war was still on, if their letters were getting through, or if they would ever be released. To fight the decay of the mind, the prisoners, often alone, created rituals. Men like John McCain would mentally recite the names of every high school classmate, every play he ever saw. They exercised in total darkness. They communicated using a sweep signal when the guards were near, indicating it was safe to resume tapping. These small acts were radical affirmations of identity. The system was designed for 100% success, and some men did break. Under unimaginable duress, they signed statements. When they returned to the collective, these men faced the deep internal conflict of guilt and failure. Men like Stockdale enforced a strict code, but they also understood the power of the will to survive. The complexity lay in the difference between breaking and collaborating. Collaboration was defined by intent. Did the statement cause harm or provide meaningful information? Most often, the statements extracted were useless propaganda designed to embarrass. The prisoners were masters of giving just enough to stop the torture without giving anything of value, an art known as the song and dance. This internal ethical dispute became the defining moral ambiguity of the entire experience. Then, silence. In January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. The TAPs stopped being orders and survival tips and became a wave of unbelievable news. They were going home. Operation Homecoming was an immediate, organized repatriation effort. The footage of the first prisoners descending the ramps of the C-141 Starlifters is one of the most emotional and iconic moments in American history. These men, starved, scarred, but unbowed, were met by a country that had largely lost faith in the war they had fought. The image of Jeremiah Denton, stepping off the plane, still struggling with his eyes due to the lack of light, saying, "We are honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country," became the enduring symbol of their resilience. The war crimes committed by the North Vietnamese were never fully prosecuted, But the lessons of the POW experience reverberated through the U.S. military. It led to a profound rethinking of survival training and the code of conduct. These men defined a new form of courage, not fighting the enemy, but resisting the surrender of the self. They proved that the ultimate weapon against totalitarian cruelty is the unbreakable connection between free men. The Vietnam veterans did not just suffer from trauma. They actively defined it for the world. They were aided by dedicated advocates like psychologist John Wilson and the aforementioned Shatan, who worked tirelessly to translate the raw experience of the veterans into clinical language. They petitioned, they protested, and they shared their most intimate horrors to ensure that the American Psychiatric Association, APA, would recognize their condition. The fight was fierce. Many established psychiatrists resisted, clinging to the belief that the symptoms were a sign of weakness or a temporary neurosis. But the evidence amassed by the veterans' relentless testimony, the clinical pattern, the clear link between overwhelming stress and persistent psychiatric symptoms became undeniable. In 1980, the APA published the third edition of its diagnostic manual, the DSM-3. Within its pages, under a new category of stress disorders, was the official entry, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The definition included criteria like re-experiencing the trauma, avoidance of stimuli, and persistent arousal. The inclusion of PTSD in the DSM-3 was more than a medical footnote. It was a profound moral victory. It was the moment the invisible wounds became visible. It validated the pain of every man who had felt like he was going crazy alone in his living room. It forced the VA to legally recognize the condition as a service-connected disability, finally opening the door for treatment and compensation. This was a victory not just for the Vietnam generation, but for every soldier who has served since. When a veteran from the Gulf War, Iraq, or Afghanistan walks into a clinic today and receives a PTSD diagnosis, they are standing on ground paved by the tireless, angry, and often heartbreaking advocacy of the Vietnam generation. That is a legacy of selfless service that transcends the trauma itself. It is a victory for veteran advocacy that benefits all soldiers who served after them. Just as the veterans fought the battle for their minds, they simultaneously engaged in a massive legal and political war over their bodies. This was the Agent Orange struggle. During the war, the U.S. military sprayed millions of gallons of herbicides, primarily Agent Orange, to defoliate jungles and deprive the enemy of cover and food. The men who handled the chemical, walked through its residue, or simply drank the water downstream were initially told it was harmless. They came home, only to watch their bodies turn against them. Years later, veterans began developing rare cancers, debilitating skin diseases, and tragically, their children were born with severe birth defects. They realized the symptoms were not random. They were a pattern, a slow-motion catastrophe linked to the pervasive toxic defoliant. The government's initial response was a denial that was both frustrating and heartbreaking. The men who had served were now being told their illnesses were coincidental. The battle for justice became a massive undertaking, culminating in the 1979 filing of a class-action lawsuit against the chemical manufacturers. This was not just a legal case. It was a political awakening. Veterans organized massive campaigns, gathering medical data, locating affected families, and challenging the powerful military-industrial complex. The pressure was immense. The lawsuit eventually settled in 1984, resulting in a $180 million fund for the veterans, a sum that, while significant, was woefully inadequate to cover the staggering medical costs of a generation. While the dollar amount was a compromise, the victory was the acknowledgement. The lawsuit broke the official wall of silence. It forced the government and the public to confront the horrifying cost of the chemical war, and demonstrated the veterans' unwavering commitment to justice for their fallen and ailing comrades. It was a testament to their tireless efforts to hold their government accountable, a continuation of their oath of service by other means, the fight to define the trauma and hold the chemical giants accountable were necessary, yet they were incomplete victories. The money ran out, the diagnoses were slow, and the fundamental question of honor remained unanswered. They had secured validation in the courts and in the medical books, but they had not yet secured a sacred space in the heart of the nation. The pain had been validated, but the sacrifice was still without a monument. The next step was not a lawsuit or a medical manual. It was a memorial, a permanent marker of national reconciliation, a wall If the fight for PTSD was about making the invisible pain visible, the final act of this generation's heroism was making their ultimate sacrifice indelible. Having fought their way into the DSM-3 and the federal courts, they turned their attention to the landscape of the National Mall. They needed a place of pure, undeniable remembrance, a place where politics could finally yield to honor. The effort was spearheaded by Vietnam veteran Jan Scruggs, who, after reading a book on the psychological toll of the war, resolved that a national monument was essential for the collective healing of the veterans and the nation. He envisioned a simple, profound statement of sacrifice. The winning design, chosen in 1981, came from a 21-year-old Yale architecture student named Maya Lin. Her concept was immediately controversial. Two long, black granite walls sunk into the earth, inscribed with the names of the dead, arranged chronologically by date of death. It was a radical departure from the triumphant, heroic statues of the past. The veterans stood fast by Lin's vision, defending the design's power against critics who wanted something more traditional. On November 13, 1982, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was dedicated. It was an instant, overwhelming success. The wall is a masterwork of national mourning and healing. Its polished, dark granite surface reflects the sky, the trees, and, critically, the face of the living viewer. When you stand before a name etched in the stone, you see yourself reflected in the context of a life lost. It is a simple, non-political, powerful monument dedicated purely to honor. There are no quotes about victory or defeat, only the truth of the sacrifice. 58,181 names. It became the sacred space that finally allowed the nation to embrace its veterans, not as symbols of a divisive war, but as sons and daughters who answered the call. The wall did not erase the pain, but it provided the hallowed ground for that pain to be shared and honored. It was the moment the homecoming finally, officially began. The wall marked a turning point, but the greatest testament to the resilience of the Vietnam veteran is what they did next. Having endured the most difficult homecoming in modern American history, they made a sacred vow. No future generation of veterans would suffer the same fate. This became their new code of honor, an intergenerational act of selfless, enduring patriotism. When American forces returned from the Gulf War, and later from the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, the Vietnam veterans were the first ones waiting at the airports, the first ones volunteering at the VA hospitals, and the first ones demanding support. They were the architects of the contemporary welcome home. They didn't just stand on the sidelines. They became active mentors, advocates, and sponsors. They applied the lessons learned in their rap groups and their PTSD advocacy to create robust, formal peer support programs for the new generation. They leveraged their hard-won political influence to ensure that funding for mental and physical health care was maintained. This act is arguably their greatest heroic legacy. It would have been human nature to be bitter, to withhold the support they themselves were denied. Instead, they put their past grievances aside, choosing to prioritize the welfare of others. They ensured that the service members of the 21st century received the parades, the handshakes, the thanks, and the essential social and medical support that was cruelly denied to them 30 years earlier. I never got my parade. I never got my handshake. But when that young Marine comes home from Fallujah and sees me standing there wearing my Vietnam hat, shaking his hand and telling him welcome home, that's my parade. That's my medal. This commitment to the next generation is the ultimate definition of their enduring patriotism. It shows a loyalty that extends not only to their comrades in the jungle, but to every American who wears the uniform. They transformed their profound trauma into a powerful protective shield for the future. Finally, their courage led them to one last, extraordinary act: reconciliation. Many veterans, having found a measure of peace at home, returned to the country that had defined their pain. They went back to Vietnam not as soldiers, but as humanitarians, healers, and bridge builders. They worked on efforts to locate the remains of their MIA POW comrades, a decades-long mission that required immense dedication and political negotiation. They also engaged in humanitarian outreach, helping to clean up unexploded ordnance, build clinics, and address the residual health issues facing the Vietnamese people, including the lingering effects of Agent Orange. This was an unparalleled demonstration of emotional courage. To return to the very ground of their trauma and extend a hand to a former enemy, to see the humanity in the people who were once the face of terror, is the mark of truly healed, resilient souls. They were closing the book on the war by focusing on the shared future, demonstrating a commitment to peace that grew directly out of their commitment to service. The history books record the battles fought in the Ia Drang Valley and Hue. But the truest, most profound acts of heroism committed by the Vietnam veteran occurred not in the jungle, but in the years after they came home. They were rejected by their government, scorned by a portion of their society, and left to grapple with invisible wounds that had no name. Yet they refused to surrender. They banded together in rap groups, forced the medical world to recognize PTSD, took on the chemical giants in the courtroom, and compelled the nation to build the sacred wall to honor their dead. And in their final, greatest act, they turned their hard-won experience into a new code of honor, vowing to protect every generation that followed. Their service was not validated by parades upon arrival, but by decades of resilient, dedicated, and selfless patriotism. The Vietnam veteran taught us that the uniform can be taken off, but the duty never ends. They fought to reclaim their honor, and in doing so, they restored the honor of the entire American military profession. They are the living monument to the unbreakable human spirit. Their fight was long, their path was difficult, but their legacy is enduring. They came home, they healed themselves, and they ensured that no one who answered the call of duty would ever have to stand alone again. And in that, they found their peace and their eternal place in the history of American courage.